simply by drawing lots out of the hat in much the way the modern way we select juries for criminal trials. Sounds like a mad idea, but there's this lost history that the original democratic society, that of the Athenian state, was ruled upon these principles. And when people tell you about the golden age of Western civilization, the birth of Western civilization, what they're talking about is this period between 458 and 338 BC, when Athens was run on an election by lottery system. And bizarrely, when people talk about the classics today in this classical period, they give you this idea that it's some sort of ruled by elite idea. It's the academies of Plato and Socrates that led this society, but it's simply not true. Now, to place this in context, the timeline, Athens was established as a city-state in about 650, no one's really entirely sure. Now, what occurred in this history was 3 periods of struggle, which changed the nature of the way that the society was run. In 594, after a long struggle, the constitution was written down. Prior to this, there was a real problem in society that only the rich and the lawyers knew the rules. And the ordinary working people of Athens were constantly losing in the courts because they simply didn't know what the law was. So there was a big struggle and a force for the constitution to be written down, and this occurred in 594. Although this is a people's struggle, it's always referred to as Solon's constitution, the name of the person who is alleged to have written the constitution. And again, this story of it being a people's struggle is lost. Athens as being some sort of constitutional monarchy, constitutional rules, oligarchy was lost in 546 when a tyrannical rule was established, and this existed for about 40 odd years. Pisistratus was replaced by his son, and he was eventually overthrown in 509. And in 509, a system of representative democracy was put in place. Now, it was a representative democratic system in that people voted for who would be in power, but it was perhaps similar in scale to the sort of representative democracy that was introduced in Britain after the Great Reform Act of 1831, where you had perhaps 5% of the population had the right to vote, and who you could elect came from that group as well. So yes, it was representative, yes, people voted, but a very small number. And again, they all had to come from this very restricted landowning class. The thing that really transformed Greek society was an extended war with Persia, which lasted about 10-12 years in total. The end wars in 480, particularly the Battle of Salamis, was really what transformed Greek Athenian society. The Athenians put out 180 naval vessels to sea to fight the Persians. Each of these needed to be stocked by between about 120 and 150 rowers. Now, if you can imagine, we're talking about 15, 20, 25,000 people rowing these boats, which was essentially a very high proportion of the adult male population of Athens. They were literally the engine room of the Athenian army. And not only did many of them die in this war, but you can imagine the generals and the admirals on the ships were having to call to these working men to row harder, to row faster, and the generals could see that the continued existence of Athens depended very much on the efforts of these sailors. There followed this war a large struggle pretty much led by the sailors, the men who had rowed these ships. And they said they were no longer happy with representative democracy that existed. And for them, it wasn't enough that the voting franchise be widened. They wanted a system where everyone ruled. Now, the slogan of the book which this talk is based on is "Every Cook Can Govern," which is a book written by C.L.R. James. And he, again, is really trying to just repeat this hidden history of Athens and ask other people to keep repeating it and talking about it. But the idea here was that everyone in society should take their turn to govern and should have the right to govern. If it was representative democracy, then those who would be elected would be the rich who had time to campaign and had time to take time off work to do that, the eloquent, the corrupt who saw it as a route to power, but ordinary working people they saw would be entirely excluded from this process. And it's perhaps an irony that today we are ruled by a cabinet of 24 people, of which 19 are millionaires, and we have very much the rule now that the Athenians feared. So in 458, true democracy was established. I'll talk more about how this ran in due course, whereby anyone could govern, and they would be selected for government simply by being drawn, their name being drawn out of the hat. And this system lasted for 80 years until Athens was overthrown by Alexander the Great. Now, for the next slide, Rich, before I talk about how it was structured, I want to talk about who was excluded from this. We have a population of about 350,000 at this time in the city-state of Athens. Excluded from the electorate and the people who are entitled to vote were all women. No women were included at all, and I don't want anyone to come away thinking that with me championing the idea of election by lottery in any way am I championing a system that excludes women. I'm looking here at the system, not the way they operated it and its exclusions. And it's worth bearing in mind that we're talking about 2,500 years ago, and it's only in 1918, I think, that women have the right to vote in this country. Similarly, all slaves are excluded. Athenians did not have the levels of slaves that later Roman society had. Most slaves were domestic servants in the houses of the rich. Agricultural workers were typically working people, ordinary free working people. All the tradesmen, all the people who worked in the navy and the armed forces, every cook, every potter, every carpenter, these were free men and were entitled to vote. It's worth bearing in mind that slavery was only abolished. Is it 250? What was the anniversary we celebrated? A couple of years ago.
The trade was banned in 1807. The slavery itself was banned in 1838.
And it was only in 1873 and at the beginning of this century that ordinary working people ordinary working men gained the right to vote in this country. So again, we have to see this in context. We're talking about society 2,500 years ago. All foreigners were excluded from voting, and it's noted that in this country that is still the case. All the Eastern European workers that work in this country were not allowed to vote in the last election. They retained the right to vote to it in their own countries, but it's still the case in this country, foreigners are excluded. All prisoners were excluded from the vote, and again, that is something that 2,500 years later in this country is still the case. Prisoners cannot vote in this country. And all under 30s were excluded from the vote. That has now come down to 18-year-olds, but it's still the case in the modern world that everyone under 18 is excluded from the franchise. So we're dealing with a restricted electorate of between about 30 and 60,000 people. The reason why it varied so much was really that this was also the armed forces, and Athens was a state at war much of the time with Persia and other nations, later with Alexander the Great, and the vagary was really due to war deaths. And in times of peace it grew, and in times of war it shrunk. But there was very much a link in their society between the people who fought and the people who participated in the democracy. Now, if we go on to the next slide, Rich, we'll talk about how this actually worked. What was the system? Now, I'm afraid this is tiny and you may struggle to see it, so I'll point to it. So here is the idea of this is the population of Athens. Oh, it's just gone out of focus, Rich. Can you... Oh. No. No, other way. Oh, let's go back again. We're never going to get in focus, I don't think. You might have to shrink it a little bit to get in focus. I'll fiddle with it a bit more. Okay, well this says the oh, that's gone more out of focus. This is the population of Athens. This is the idea of all the men and women. This is the idea that the 30 to 60,000 free men of 30 years or older, Athenian men who were entitled to vote. Now, the sovereign body in the Athenian state was not a king or queen, it was a popular assembly. And the popular assembly would meet about once a month. And the popular assembly was just any one of these people could go, this 30 to 60,000. It had a quorum of 6,000. 6,000 people were necessary to attend this meeting to be quorum, to establish the sovereign power of the country. Originally they struggled to get people to attend because it was during the day and they were at work, and a rule was brought in that people would be paid to attend the popular assembly to encourage ordinary people to come. And the popular assembly would decide things like who would go to war, when they would go to war. If you wanted to go to war, you had to go to the popular assembly, get a majority of the 6,000. The budget would go to the popular assembly, and also the members of the popular assembly would debate policies that they wanted the council that actually run the city on a day-to-day basis to operate. So this was ideally the most important body, but the day-to-day running of the city was run by the council. The council was 500 people selected by lottery. Again, ordinary working men over 30. The majority of these would have been working class men. The city was split into 10 separate sectors. Each sector would select 50 people by lottery. There were 10 months of the year in the Greek calendar, and 10 from each district would sit for a month each. No, that's not right. 5 from each. Let's get through it. 500, 50 per region, divided by 10, you have 5 from each region per month. So you would have this rolling body of people that would sit on the council month by month, and they would serve for a couple of years, and then you'd have to have a new election, a new selection by lottery. They would split into sub-roles, which they would also draw by lottery, and they would meet every single day to discuss the business of the city, and every single day a new leader of the council would be selected by lottery. It had to be a new person each day, and they would decide the ordinary business of the city under the direction of the Popular Assembly. Now you can imagine over time this meant that more and more people in the ordinary population had experience of being in charge of the city of the day, and the historians say that once it was established, the attendance of the Popular Assembly, the 6,000 people who attended, approximately 25% of these people had experience of running the city for a day. They would never do it for more than a day because that would be their turn, that would be their time. And then once their time was over, they would return to their population and they wouldn't be available for selection for the next election. So this idea is that leadership, rather than something that the worthy and the good and the great be voted for, it was a responsibility, it was a burden of the ordinary population that you'd have to take your turn, you'd have to be in charge of the council, and you'd have to turn up at the Popular Assembly in front of the 6,000 to justify your actions. And we can imagine what a difference this would make to politics if this is how we run, say, a city council such as Bristol with a similar population, 300, 350,000 people. If our local councillors, rather than people who saw themselves as getting out of the city in a way and advancing their political careers, were people who were simply short-term taken away from their communities and then would have to be returned to their communities afterwards. Other aspects of the city were also run by election by lottery. The courts were run on a jury system, unlike the English criminal system where you have a judge that decides the law and the jury that decides the facts. Under the Greek system, the judge was reduced to the level of the court clerk. The jury would decide how to interpret the law, and the jury would decide what the facts were. All the judge would do was tell the jury what the Constitution said. The judge had no role whatsoever in interpretation or decision making. I'm not sure whose phone that is, it may be mine. No. Yeah, it's probably mine if it's coming out through the loudspeaker. There we go, it's on. Again, you would have juries of different sizes, 200, 400, 500, depending on the size of the case. Anyone could take a case in front of the jury, and also, if a decision of the Popular Assembly wished to be challenged, you could take it to the Popular Tribunal and say, no, this is wrong, it's not been considered in sufficient detail, and you could take it in front of a jury of citizens, and they would decide the issue. Again, as someone whose my main practice is as a lawyer, mainly representing people who are injured in the workplace, I would much prefer this system and would have much more success under this system than I would do appearing in front of a single professional judge with a judicial career where the judge is always deciding, well, I don't want to get into trouble with people more powerful than the people who are bringing the claimants who are bringing this case in front of me. Again, these people, after their year of service on the jury, again, they would rotate, they wouldn't sit permanently, they would return to the communities. So their decisions will be not the decisions of people who had escaped the communities and were going on in their own way and seeking to advance in society. There were people who were sitting in this situation temporarily and would then have to return to the community. With both these positions, again, people were paid. It wasn't voluntary, because if it was voluntary, only the rich could do it. So there would be payments, not huge payments, but payments enough that ordinary working people wouldn't suffer from sitting on these panels. The Greek religion was a very big part of society, and the Greek religion organised a series of festivals every year. In Athens, There were no priests, there were no bishops. The people in charge of religion were selected by lottery every single year, and this lottery committee would organise every year's festivals, the drama festivals, the music festivals, the harvest festivals. And that was the way they ran it. And the religion was, without bishops and priests and without books, there was no dogma to it, because every year it would be a different group of people in charge. And it was, well, you still saw what happened last year and the year before and the year before that. How do you want to organise this year's festivals? And their budget will be allocated by the Popular Assembly. Well, it will be taken to the Popular Assembly and they will vote on it, and then that's how they would decide it. The one aspect of society that was by election, by voting rather than by lottery, was the military. The generals in charge of the army were elected by the Popular Assembly. Now, when you read the more modern texts on Athens society, they often talk about Pericles being the leader of Athens during this period. He wasn't the leader of Athens. The leader of Athens was the Popular Assembly. Pericles was the general of the army for 30 years. But each and every year, Pericles had to stand for re-election in front of the Popular Assembly, justify his military conduct, and be re-elected. So the fact that he was re-elected for 30 years is not, okay, you can understand that maybe he was a man of some great stature, but nevertheless, he wasn't the leader. He was the person who the Popular Assembly appointed to lead the army. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, Rich? I think I've gone through all aspects of that. So, when we come to talking about classical Athens, classical education is generally considered to be something that is taught in the elite schools and universities. It is told to us as being something that helps for leadership, that this is why we are ruled by the public school boys and the Oxbridge candidates, because they understand the classics, they've had this education, they've read their Plato. And it seems bizarre that, in fact, all these people, these famous people from this period, all existed under this society, which is in fact election by lottery. The criticism of election by lottery is that it would be anarchy, it would be chaos. Well, if it was such anarchy and chaos, why is it still to this day considered to be the greatest civilization of all time, that all these people, and many more, came out of a population of 350,000 over a period of 80 years? Now, if we think of Bristol over the last 80 years, we've got Cary Grant and Robin Cousins. Oh, and the guy who's Darth Vader. We've got nothing on this sort of scale of people who are known today. Now, there were other criticisms of society. For instance, one of the great criticisms is that the courts of Athens tried Socrates and put him to death. Of its time, this is true, this happened. It was a jury selected from the people. They decided he should be arrested. Well, the Popular Assembly decided he should be arrested and tried. He went in front of a jury of ordinary Athenians, and they put him to death. And it was Plato, in response to this, who launched his attack in his books, particularly The Republic, on the idea of election by lottery. And it was Plato who argued that, in fact, the best way of government is elected democracy, where we elect the elites, that Plato set up the academy, and that people should go to the academy, they should learn about philosophy and science and all other matters, and then they should be fit for leadership. And it's that message that we are taught is the message of classical Athens, where in fact the opposite is the message that should be true, because every society since then, well, for about 1,000 years or so, there were no democracies after this, but when democracies arose eventually, really after the French Revolution, they followed Plato's ideals of democracy, and not one has been as successful society as this one. And these are all people who, we're not talking just about a society that was rich and prosperous in terms of agriculture and metalwork and other products. It was a society that was rich in all sorts of spheres of life that only rich societies can be rich in, because it's a society that's created an excess to allow people to study science and medicine, to consider things as sculpture and philosophy. The playwrights of Athens, the classical writers of the tragedies and comedies are still to this day considered to be the greatest playwrights of all time. Those who go to the schools that teach classical literature tell you, oh well, there's never been a playwright as good as Aristophanes. Well, the reason why Aristophanes is famous is because at the Festival of Dionysus each year, all the playwrights would compete and put on their plays and be selected as the winner. And he won it 9 years, 9 times in total. Well, who selected him as the winner? Well, of course, a panel selected by lottery from the general population. Ordinary working men over 30, Athenian men, and I keep saying men because that's who it was, I'm not saying that's the correct way to do it, but that's what they did. Ordinary working men managed to select this man as the greatest playwright in Athens, and 2,500 years later, we are taught that, oh, well, you have to study the classics to understand how great these people were. These people were populists. These people wrote popular plays. They weren't obscure, high art, high culture people. And it's, again, this is what's worth repeating, is that the idea that such a society would be chaos just isn't borne out when you look at what came out of this society. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about how we might apply this to modern society. And of course, in my view, it would be great if the entirety of modern Britain was run on this basis. But it seems specifically that there are some obvious ways that we could adapt this to modern life in a reformist way rather than the revolutionary way. And the first thing that jumped out at me was when people were talking about the reform of the House of Lords. Well, what is the House of Lords? It's a second chamber. It's a reviewing body. It looks at legislature put through by the House of Commons and then decides, well, in all our experience, is this right? Is it wrong? Should it be amended? Can we come up with other ideas? Well, this is obviously something which should be selected by lottery, that we shouldn't have lords, we shouldn't have aristocrats or party grandees appointed, that each constituency in this country should simply select someone by lottery to serve for a year in the House of Lords to review legislation. They can be put into panels of 12, 24, 50, whatever it is, and look at the legislation and review it, and by definition, they must be representative of the population. If we drew 650 people by random from the population, they must be representative of the population. They must have all the interests that are in the population. They will have the geographical spread. They will have the social spread. You could come up with a rule, perhaps, that you have to be over 55 to be available for selection by lottery or something to give you the life experience you might need for this position. Or it might be more suitable for someone at that age to sit down and sit and review legislation at that age. But it just seems that it's almost an obvious answer to what the second chamber should be, that it should be a jury panel. One of the things, I'll just go off a tangent, one of the things that jumped out at me on the EDO decommissioners case, are you aware of this case? That the people who went down to the EDO arms factory and smashed it up on the basis that they were selling arms to the Israelis that were at that time being used to suppress the people who were uprising in Gaza. Now, the narrative that we are given by our government and our media is that we are at war with radical Islam, and that support must be given to Israel because their war with Hamas is on another level a war with radical Islam. And yet, these 5 people who went into this factory went in front of a jury of 12 people and told them a different story, and told them the story of what was going on in Gaza, and explained their reasons for why they had done their actions, why they'd gone in and smashed up the factory, that they were seeking to prevent greater harm. And the jury acquitted them. What was even more shocking to me was that the media didn't report this. If you did media researches, there were 3 papers that covered this. The Morning Star covered it on its front page. No other newspaper covered it on its front page. The only other mainstream newspaper that covered it at all was The Guardian. It had an article that big that just reported the fact that Caroline Lucas, the Green MP for Brighton, had spoken in their favour. It said nothing about the case, nothing about the reasons, and nothing about this astonishing fact that a jury of 12 ordinary people had gone against what seemed to be government policy and the line that was given to us by the media. And it shows how much faith you can have in ordinary people, and how just the common sense that ordinary people will bring, because they are coming from a vast range of backgrounds and cannot, by definition, have vested interests, or not vested interests that can dominate. And if these people were in the House of Lords reviewing legislation from the House of Commons. What a better system it would be. Or I should say the third paper that reported it was the Jewish Chronicle, who ran the line that the judge was an anti-Semite. But those were the only 3 media coverage of this entire event. The second place where it seems to me obvious that this should be introduced at a local level in Bristol is an idea that was introduced recently of community partnerships, that the council splits the city up into areas of community partnerships, typically 3 wards at a time, and the idea that people sit on committees with councillors to discuss local issues. Now, the criticism of this is who is on these local panels? Well, the people on these local panels are people who are already on other bodies, other voluntary bodies, people from the local parks committees, people, not necessarily bad people, people from Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Green Party. But what you have is a selection of middle-class liberals, well-meaning, but these aren't ordinary people from the communities, and in no way can someone who's not from a working-class community speak for that community. You can try, but all you can do is advocate for them. You can't actually represent them in a true, direct sense. And it seems to me if these community partnerships are going to work, then they must select who sits on these panels by lottery, presumably a large number because a lot of them won't turn up. But if we simply selected 200 people by lottery off the electoral register and said, right, you are, for the next 6 months, on your community partnership, you will only have to go to 3 meetings, but at those 3 meetings you will discuss the matters that your councillors have for your local area. I mean, some of it is car parking, some of it is bins, ideas for parks, basic issues. But how much better would this be than a system where it's just representative elected peoples who must come from one of the 3 main parties, otherwise they don't stand a chance of being elected, or other worthies who know that it's going on, who have the time to attend. The third idea which we had, which is from the Bristol Radical History Group, and an idea we ran an election special, a series of events at the time of the last election, and we had this idea of actually starting a lottery party. And the idea was really to do this at a local level, at a council level. Typically 23 or 24 wards are up for election at one time, and we had this idea that we would advertise the idea of a lottery party, and what you would do if you joined the lottery party, your name will go into the hat for selection as the lottery party candidate, and 4 weeks before the election you would draw out your 23, 24 names. They will be your candidates for the wards. You would register those in the 3-week period with the council and then encourage people to vote for the lottery party candidate. This is not a Labour Party or a Conservative Party or a Liberal Party or a Green Party. This is simply someone drawn at random from the community to represent that community. Now, it's true that some of these people will be insane, that there's a chance that you will get a racist. There's a chance you will get someone who will just use it for their own ends. There's a chance that you will select someone who's really not very intelligent at all. But really, these are the faults of representative democracy as well. And if we look at our council house and our House of Commons, it is full of people who are out for their own ends, who are perhaps insane, who certainly aren't very intelligent. We certainly have a considerable number of alcoholics in the House of Commons. And that's why they have so many bars, and that's why they subsidise their bars. But I can't believe that they can possibly be any worse than the people we get in power at the moment. And again, these would be people who this would not be stage 1 on their political career. This would not be, now I'm a councillor, now I've got to work within the party and try and get a seat for Parliament, because as soon as their time was over, they would have to go back to the community. There's no re-election, because the next selection will be by lottery. So it would be someone who was there knowing at all times they would have to go back to their community. And this, I think, is one of the major problems with politicians, is as soon as you're an elected politician, you've escaped from your community and you're not going to return. And the idea that we should be ruled by ourselves, an election as soon as you have a party political system, then it's someone asking to elect you. The whole fault of much of left-wing politics is the idea that some party will arise that will march in the vanguard of the left and lead us to power. But who are these people who are asking us to vote for them into power? And who can stand up and say, well, I am the person who will represent you and I'll be true and fair and represent the values of society? It seems almost to me that anyone who puts them forward for such a position should automatically be banned from standing, because the idea of thinking that you should be someone to represent society suggests that you can't be fit to do so. That the idea that people who should stand in these positions must be people who are made to do it, rather than have chosen to do it. But that was the third idea, and it's still an idea we're playing with, and the idea is we might set it up as a political party over the next year or so. It takes a bit of work, but it doesn't cost much at a local level. You'd have the problem that party registration requires there to be a leader, but on the basis that selection for candidates for seats would have to be selected by lottery, then that leader wouldn't really have any power other than overseeing the system. But, well, look, those are my ideas on election by lottery. We've got lots of time left, so if anyone's got anything to add to it, anyone's got ideas that they think might be interesting about election by lottery or any questions, then I'll open it up to the floor.
I'll just ask a kind of naive question, really. I mean, I think Athens is fascinating. I know Marie Bookchin's kind of written all over those stuff about the civic democracy of Athens in a adulatory way, and I suppose the naive question is why it hasn't been replicated more in history. I mean, I think a lot of the medieval guild governments and things were very democratic and had a lot more of a kind of connection with their particular place than obviously the kind of representative democracy we've got today. But if it was so effective, the obvious question is why hasn't it been replicated more?
Well, it's an interesting question. There's a very interesting book on the birth of representative democracy on the French Revolution by Bellegarrigue, which in the past was sold in a bookstore, and I don't think we've got it there anymore. And it's called The Anarchist Manifesto. And he writes immediately after the introduction of full franchise in France. So there have been several revolutions, several returns to monarchy, back to revolution, different systems of restricted vote, and finally, and I say full enfranchisement, what I mean is all men who were Protestants, who weren't in prison, had the vote. No women had the prison, no Catholics had the prison, no women had the vote, no Catholics had the vote, but everyone else did. And at the first election, where that was the case, that all working men had the vote, 1/3 didn't vote, and the 2/3 who did returned to power the monarchist party on a strict law and order rule agenda. He said, how could this have happened in a representative democracy? And he talks about, well, you've got to understand that the media were entirely on the side of the monarchists, that the money was all on the side of the monarchists, and he also writes about the leftists. He says, well, who are they representing? His criticism often talks to about who are these people who say they are representing me? Who are these people who say they should vote for me? And his criticism is that the whole system of representative democracy is not in fact about freedom at all. It's about power, it's about control of power. And you have a society where people simply will not accept monarchy anymore, and representative democracy is a step along from that. But it is not a society of freedom. It is more free than democracy. It is better, but it is still the idea that you are giving over your freedoms to someone else to rule over you, and they are simply being selected by lottery, but selected by a very narrow pool. And we can see it in the last election. How can people possibly stand against the machines, party machines, of Labour, Conservatives and Liberals? It is the same as trying to set up a shop to compete with Tesco's and Sainsbury's, or to try and sell a new cola against the marketing power of Coca-Cola and Pepsi. They're simply not markets you can enter. And we've got to see representative democracy as a market in the same way as the Coca-Cola market is and the groceries market is, that it becomes dominated by these large parties, and it's almost inevitable that it will be, because you need the scale, you need the money, you need the machine, you need the party volunteers who will work within the system. And there is, for that system to work, you must have a hierarchy, and you must have people at the top who are being elected, because they're the ones who say, I'm putting all this effort in because I'm going to be elected. Well, if you have a system where you've got no idea who's going to be elected, well, then all the efforts from your leaders is gone, because what's their interest to do it? It's almost as if we need a moment in society like the Greeks had after the Battle of Salamis, where such a huge proportion of the population had given so much that they demanded this. And it must be the case that people in society would have to demand it for the change to occur. There was perhaps a moment after World War I where we're in a comparable situation where so many people had given so much to save the country. Perhaps this was a moment. And in fact, we saw many things happen at that time. Well, for a start, there was enfranchisement for women. There was the rise of the Labour Party, which many people thought would be the solution to the representation of working people in this country. And perhaps for a while it was, but it's certainly not now. Many people will say it wasn't, but...
It never was.
Well, no, I don't know. It's not an area of history that I knew, but certainly people thought it was. And people...
Anarchists out, right?
Yeah.
In the flavour industry.
So it must be something that people must demand, but there's no way that those in power would. Sorry, you can intervene here. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
I mean, this system that you're discussing, I mean, it's really interesting, but it was the ruling class of Athens that actually partook. I mean, the working class, presumably the slaves, and to some extent, you know, there's
The slaves didn't partake, this is true.
And the domestic working class.
Yeah.
What would happen if you had a lottery system with the existing class makeup, multi-class society that we've got at the moment?
Well, they did have a multi-class society in Athens. They did. I mean, yes, there was an aristocracy, there were rich landowners, but they were the minority within this 60,000 group of electorate.
With the slaves, weren't they?
Well, slaves were majoritarily domestic slaves. It's what I've not read into this the level that many of the people have. But agricultural workers would have been involved in this system.
Right.
Naval, you know, the naval mariners would have been in the system. The carpenters, the potters, the cooks. All these people would have been involved in this, and they would have been the majority. They would have been the vast majority. The vast majority of people on the council, the vast majority of people in the courts, on the religious committees, would have been ordinary working people. I mean, yes, by the rules of the lottery, there would have been some aristocrats selected for the system, but they would have been the minority within every single... Can we go back to the third one? I think it's the third, yeah. The one slide back. Every single one of these... I mean, yes, these people, the military rulers, would have almost certainly been aristocrats. But all these bodies would have been mainly made up by working people. I mean, yes, domestic slaves were excluded, but the vast majority of this 30 to 60,000 people would have been ordinary working people, because most ordinary working people were free people. Slaves tended to be people brought from outside Athens to work in domestic as domestic servants in the households of the rich, and there were certainly a lot of them. But within this citizen group, these would have mostly been ordinary working people. And this is what has to come through of this, is that, yes, there was an aristocracy, but they would have numbered in their hundreds. They wouldn't have numbered in their thousands. So I don't know the precise proportions, because class divides are always difficult to say.
What would happen if somebody, I mean, presumably the lottery worked, that everybody, all the electors, everybody's name was put into this, into the lottery. So what happens if some people don't actually want to do it for whatever reason they might have? You know, as it happens with any kind of organisation, there's always people say, well, I can't do the minutes, or I can't do this, or I can't.
I'm not sure. I've looked at this because the point occurred to me, and there is contradictory evidence as to whether it was compulsory or whether putting your name in for the lottery was a voluntary act. So anyone could put their name in and you'll be selected. So you would have to volunteer so far as putting your name in. So that was the model we thought with the idea of a lottery party. By joining the party, you're putting your name in, and therefore up for election or up for selection. So my understanding is it was not compulsory, but the vast majority of the population were putting their names in because they were keen to become involved, and also because it was paid for ordinary working people. It wasn't that's an option. I'll do my month a year for a couple of years, and I'll get paid for it. Gets me out of the bakery for that month. What was certainly the case is that employers had to let their employees go to serve on the various councils and bodies in much the way as they have to do today with military reservists. If you're a military reservist, by law, your employer has to release you, and they will be paid by the government for that time, and you won't pay them. It was a similar system to that an employer would have to release the employee for their month's service on these panels, whether it was the council, the popular tribunal. I don't think the religious bodies met that often, because they were really only organising the festivals, and they were much smaller bodies. But certainly the council and the courts was a I'm not sure if it's 9 to 5, but that sort of day in, day out job for the month in which you served of your year. So the idea today would be, it was a similar thing. I mean, ideally, if you would legislate, you'd want that idea of it being rotating, that you'd serve for a month a year for a few years. Perhaps, if it's a 4-year term on a council, you would perhaps select 4 people who would do a quarter of the year in rotation for 4 years. That wouldn't work now because we can't do the legislation, so it'd have to be, they would be your selected councillor for the year. And then they wouldn't be for the next year.
Well, it just strikes me that it works kind of the jury service system works now, which is really where you are obliged to go and you've got a good reason not to go.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go actually.
Yeah.
But employers have to let you go.
Yeah.
That's probably the fairest system we have.
The jury system's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Every defence lawyer will tell you, and I don't do criminal law, but every defence criminal lawyer will tell you, of course you want to be in front of a jury. It's also, what shows to be as well, if you sit down and do a crossword with 12 people, you'll find that you will answer it really, really quickly, just because just by having 12 people there, you've almost always got someone who thinks of an answer to a question, and however intelligent a single person is, it's really hard to beat the wisdom of 12. And if you're dealing with larger numbers of 20 or 25 or 30, and this idea that knowledge gathered in an academy somehow makes you superior and better able to exercise decision-making power, it's just not true. Judges are awful. And when I talk to my clients about going in front of a judge, I tell them, look, the biggest variable we have in this case is not the facts, it's not the law, it's the judge. We want a nice judge who's liberal, who's friendly and in a good mood, and if we've got that, we've got a good chance of winning. If we've got a nasty judge who's in a bad mood, who doesn't like you because of their prejudices, we're going to lose. Whereas a jury of 12 people, well, now, prejudices are going to balance out to some extent. I mean, yes, you still have racial prejudice and everything else, but you're not going to get the same sort of class prejudices because you're going to get the spread. Much, much better chance of getting justice in front of 12 people and getting the right decision.
The only thing is, there have been an awful lot of miscarriages such as this, when you think over the last, quite
in front of juries, But that was principally where the police were putting in front of false evidence.
I was thinking whether that would be the judge directing, because the judge still directs the jury.
Yeah. Well, this is the beauty of this system, is the judge is just, well, this is the law, you have to interpret it. Whereas juries can be forced down a line by the judge. This was the Jewish Chronicle line, that because the judge in the EDO case had permitted the jury the freedom to make these decisions, he must be an anti-Semite. Because another judge, and it's certainly true, another judge could have simply not permitted them the freedom to make those decisions. In the Ireland miscarriage of justice cases, the jury were faced with false evidence, and often given by unidentified police and witnesses. So you can understand why it was a miscarriage, but there's certainly less chance of miscarriage than if you're in front of a judge. Who really would have given these people no time at all. Certainly where someone's up against police officers and there's a conflict of fact, the police say one thing occurred and the person who's been arrested and charged says another thing occurred, you certainly want to be in a jury because your chances of being believed by a jury against a police officer are far, far greater than they would be in front of a judge. But it just seems it's an idea of governance which fits anarchic principles. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about the people who serve on the council, by extension in the courts?
Yeah.
Would they need to be inducted?
I don't know. What there was in the council, there was a civil service. There were civil servants who, I guess, may have assisted them, but at the same time, the council have the power to dismiss civil servants. So there was that role that there were permanent civil servants of the city who worked in the city and would have presumably directed them in the same way as council officers and civil servants do today. In the courts, there was a judiciary, but the judge was reduced to this position of saying, this is the constitution, this is the law that this person is charged under. Because again, they had the system where you had to know what you're being charged under, you had to know what the law was, you couldn't just go into court and the idea of what the law was being left unclear. So again, there was that, civil service role, someone guiding. It wasn't entirely left to them, free to do what they liked. But in both cases, the decision-making was with the people selected by lottery.
I don't get the time factor in this. I mean, people were in these positions for how long exactly? It's just something about a day?
They would serve a month at a time on the council and in the tribunal. the period of election, I cannot establish for sure whether it's a year, 2 years, 3 years, whether they would serve repeatedly. But basically, at the beginning of the year, a large number of people would be selected for that entire year, and then be split up month by month, that they would serve a month at a time in rotation.
What was the relationship of Athens to the rest of Greece? I mean, how did the democracy operate?
There were a whole series of city-states around Greece. I was looking yesterday, researching this, for instance, I talked about the Battle of the Salamis, and 12 different city-states committed ships to fight the Persians, of which the vast majority came from Athens. But there were places like Sparta, you would have heard of, and many, many other smaller states. So the vast majority of urban populations were city-states, the majority of which were run on this basis for smaller periods of time, but many of us had other systems. What is also true is outside those city-states, there were vast tracts of agricultural land that was owned by aristocrats, and was ruled by aristocrats without any system of democracy whatsoever. But the cities and the ports where the trades were taking place were all organised into small city-states. But Athens was the one that, well, certainly by far the largest, and it was the one that introduced selection by lottery, and it's the one that had it for the longest. And it's also the one that is the best recorded, because Athens produced its own historians who wrote down this history, so people can go and read the history. This is from Wikipedia, this map, but this is taken from the historians at the time who recorded how the system worked. And there's 2 or 3 of them who have their own records as to how it was recorded. I've operated from secondary sources. I've not gone to the original Greek because I can't read it. I've gone very much to secondary sources, and to a large extent I've relied on C.L.R. James's version of how it worked, but also looked at a few other secondary sources.
I think one of the drawbacks these days is the pure size of our cities. I mean, in those days you were talking about 30, 50,000, so the size of a small town in Britain today.
Well, this was 350,000.
Oh,
350,000, so bigger. That's to say it's the size of Bristol.
Yeah, I was right.
Yeah.
Right. But I suppose the other thing, I wonder if there would have been such a transient population. Maybe there was in those days, as much as we have today.
Yeah, well, there would have been migration because it was a port, but then foreigners were excluded. I think that it was probably fairly stable just because it was a prosperous place.
What do they mean by foreigners? Do they mean sort of non-Athenians, or do they mean non-Greeks?
Non-Athenians. But you could become an Athenian. You didn't have to be born an Athenian. You could become an Athenian. But if you lived in the city and hadn't become an Athenian, you didn't take part in the system.
And there was presumably some sort of way that the city-states kind of had some kind of interaction. How did that work?
Yeah, it was the council would receive ambassadors and would also carry out all foreign policy. So when the councils of other city-states wanted to organise with Athens something, they would go to the council. If you're from a foreign country, you would go to the council. So all dealings with foreign powers was all dealt with by the council. And in fact, they would have had a subcommittee within the council, day in, day out, to deal with foreign policy, if you like. And a separate body would deal with the civil day-to-day matters of the city.
You say 350 the population, yeah?
Yeah.
There are a large percentage of tenant slaves and stuff like that.
It was about different figures between 50 and 150,000 were slaves.
How many?
Between 150,000 and 150,000 were slaves. And then you had the women excluded, those under 30 excluded. So that population doesn't include the foreign-based people. So it got down to between about 30 to 60,000 was the body that was selected by lottery, and that was Athenians who were men over 30 who weren't in prison, but would have been majority working class people. And by working class I mean tradesmen, craftsmen, shopkeepers, cooks, people who served in the armed forces, and they were the vast majority of the population. Sorry?
I said you'd have women in the equation.
Well, yeah, as I said, from 1918 onwards in this country we've had women. As you can see, the country's been revolutionised. It doesn't bear any resemblance to how it was before 1918. Look, we've still got to get prisoners. We've still got to get prisoners involved, and we've still got to get people under 18 involved. So we've still got a way to go to full representative democracy in this country. And there's still, the Eastern European workers don't get a vote in this country.
Prisoners are getting their own selves involved.
Yeah.
So people don't want to vote. Because I don't see any reason.
Yeah, well, again, we talked about that, the Belgrade criticism of representative democracy. He was completely against voting as soon as voting was introduced as a policy. You know, the year after the first full male franchise election, he was against voting. You know, I'm entirely with you on that. I understand that attitude. The idea of a lottery party would be to come up with some sort of party that could be a community party, that could draw people from communities to rule themselves. And I can't see any other way. I don't think a vanguard party of the left can ever do that, however righteous it might be, because it's always going to be afflicted by leaders. We're going to have to finish up because we've got to sit down for the next talk.
Issue of private property, does it?
Well, it doesn't deal with any legislation because that would be entirely down to the Popular Assembly and the Council. If the Popular Assembly decided they wanted to do away with private property, they could do. If the Popular Assembly said, well, we want to keep private property, what we want to restrict is people owning anything other than their own home, then they could do that. But you know, it is not for leaders to decide what the policies should be that the population should follow. It is for the population to decide how they should be ruled. And it's not up for us to say, well, look, the population will rule themselves and these are the policies they will have. No, who the hell are you to say these are the policies they will have? They'll decide it for themselves. That's the whole point of self-rule. You decide what your rules should be. And it's an odd thing, as soon as we start to be top-down about saying what people, we're educated, we've read books, we know what will make things better for people. No, we don't. And we've got no right to say we do. We can discuss it with them, but as soon as you start saying, well, here's your manifesto, this is what you should vote for, it's in your interest, I'm in your interest, vote for me, you're straight down the wrong line. Okay, we're going to have to finish off because we've got